All right, so I've gotten a few questions about January 6th, Trump's election denial, and the fake electors plot. And I'm going to address all of that, and I'm going to talk about what I think the merits of Trump's argument were, as well as the demerits of his arguments and his actions. Before I get into that, I think it's important to paint a picture of the MAGA worldview from 2016 to 2024. And first, I'll acknowledge that I voted against Trump in 2016. I voted against him in 2020. And I'm voting for him now in 2024. But I'm looking back retroactively to try to understand what was the perspective of someone who voted for him in 2016 and 2020. Prior to 2016, I think everyone would have agreed that Washington is very corrupt, that they spend taxpayer money incredibly inefficiently, that we have this never-ending carousel of politicians who lie, who make promises and don't follow through on them, and that government feels really ineffective relative to what it can be. And then Trump came as the embodiment of that message with his clarion call to drain the swamp. Prior to 2016, I think everyone would have agreed we need to drain the swamp, but Trump, in his demeanor, in his character, in his very braggadocious affect, was very triggering to a lot of people. And they might have agreed with the message prior to 2016, but they didn't like the messenger. But Trump represented, in a sense, almost like a third-party candidate, because you have to remember that when Trump arrived on the scene, he was not part of the establishment. He had never been in politics before. He was a businessman and media darling who got into politics, was a very unlikely candidate to win, and basically took over a Republican Party that was initially extremely resistant to him through sheer force of will and a populist movement that was in support of him that felt tired of establishment Republicans and Democrats not delivering the results that they actually cared about. And a lot of these people had felt like they had been disenfranchised from 8 years of Obama's presidency, and they felt like there had been identity politicking that made everything about race, while the manufacturing base for blue-collar workers in middle America and the South and a lot of white people, frankly, was disappearing, and Washington didn't seem to care. So that was a perspective of the MAGA movement. It was that there is a swamp, it needs to be drained. These politicians are getting us into forever wars that are running us up trillions of dollars of debt while feeding into the military-industrial complex and enriching the pockets of Lockheed Martin and Boeing and getting us embroiled in foreign conflicts that are not actually solving the problems that we have at home, while the border is being overrun by people who are eroding the social fabric of America, and this insight came later, but while Big Pharma is funding 45% of the FDA's budget and making us sicker and fatter and dumber while not actually resolving the healthcare issues that we have in this country. And basically a radical change was needed. Like, these people did not want an incremental change. They wanted a radical change, and they didn't want an establishment politician. And that's what Trump represented. And as a result, a lot of these people had a default of skepticism toward the establishment itself. Now, when Trump arrived on the scene, he pointed out that the swamp needs to be drained, and he also pointed out that this is the environment of fake news. So we need to stop trusting the mainstream media. And in hindsight, he was actually incredibly correct about that. And I think most people, regardless of what side you're on, hopefully can recognize that right now, that, yeah, the news is extremely biased and fake. But now imagine you're someone who was following the MAGA movement from 2016 to 2020. And when Trump was running, you saw CNN, MSNBC, and New York Times consistently take Trump's comments out of context, accusing him of calling white supremacists very fine people when that's explicitly not what he did. And then he gets into office and he signs the Doha Treaty, which gets us out of Afghanistan finally. No new wars start. The economy remains good. He starts actually building the wall, and yet all you see is negativity from establishment politicians toward him and the mainstream media. Well, of course, you're going to become entrenched in your position, and your skepticism of institutions is only going to deepen. Then we get to 2020, and 2020 was an incredibly disruptive event for everyone because of all the mixed messaging around COVID And then people got to really see under the hood of vaccine making, how vaccine companies are not liable for a lot of what they make. They got even less liability because of the conditions around COVID and wanting to accelerate the production of vaccines. Then there were vaccine mandates. So that only deepened the institutional skepticism. Then on top of that, and this is after 2020, but on top of that, we also see the legal system being weaponized against Trump. And it felt like for 4 years after Trump left office, there was this constant campaign of trying to find something to stick Trump with, something. And eventually what they settled on was a felony for, frankly, something that looked like a lot of people to be a misdemeanor, and him paying $100,000 to Stormy Daniels, basically for her to not talk about the sexual affair that they may or may not have had. And then the sexual assault case that was only made technically viable within the statute of limitations due to a legal change that happened in the district where Trump got prosecuted around the time that Trump left office. So there were just a lot of things that a lot of people looked at and said, hey, we actually mistrust government and we don't trust how they operate more generally. So now if we zoom in on 2020, if that's your worldview, well, what happened in 2020? This was, again, amidst the lockdowns and the vaccine mandates that many people disagreed with. And then on top of that, we went from 33 million mail-in ballots to 65 mail-in ballots in 2020. So in 2016, there were 33 million, 65 million in 2020. And then we also saw that conservative voices were getting censored on Instagram and Twitter. And after Elon bought Twitter, we found out through the Twitter files that the FBI was actively complicit in flagging accounts for Twitter to look into and, in many cases, ban, including Trump's own account. That he was one of the accounts that got flagged and banned. Then we also find out the Hunter Biden laptop story, and we found out that legacy media suppressed a story that actually could have swung the election because it could have implicated Biden and Joe Biden in illegal activity. So you look at all of this, and then understandably, there was some skepticism around the 2020 election. And what we know for sure is that there was election interference, 100%, because of, again, the Twitter files. And now, a few months ago, Mark Zuckerberg revealed that Meta was also pressured by the government to censor on its platforms, both Instagram and Facebook. So if you understand that whole backdrop, it makes a lot of sense that a lot of the MAGA movement was very skeptical of the election results, especially when they saw that Trump was leading in the election count, and then all of a sudden he wasn't leading anymore. So now if we look between November and January, of course, Trump looks at all of this, and he's been assaulted for 4 years straight, and he's very skeptical that the election was done in a legitimate way. His followers are very skeptical that it's been done in a legitimate way. So yeah, they fight like hell. Of course they choose to fight like hell. Of course there's skepticism. Of course they're going to challenge the results. So what happened from November to January? Well, there were a lot of legal challenges in the courts, and now we get to the fake electors plot. Now, before we talk about the fake electors plot, I think it's important to acknowledge that even the framing of fake electors plot is incredibly uncharitable. It's kind of like calling conspiracy theories rather than just calling them alternative hypotheses. So how about instead of calling it a fake elector plot, we call it what it is without sort of the editorializing, which is the submission of alternate slates of electors. And this is one of a slew of legal procedural challenges that the Trump campaign tried to introduce to not to just defraud anyone and turn over the election results, but to delay the process of certifying the election and try to find some sort of conclusive proof that could force a recount. And this is not without legal precedent, because in the 1960s, in the race between Nixon and Kennedy in Hawaii, Nixon won by a very thin margin, and Kennedy's camp challenged the results and demanded a recount. While the recount was happening, they submitted an alternate slate of electors who would certify that Kennedy won the election in anticipation of hopefully the courts or the election commission overturning the count. Now, as it turns out, as it so happened, actually they redid the count and Nixon actually lost. So Kennedy's alternate slate of electors was submitted. And to provide a little bit of context on how this works, so I think we all know that the popular vote is not actually what determines the election, it's the Electoral College. So what happens is in a state, let's say in Hawaii in this case, if the people of Hawaii vote, in this case for Nixon, then Nixon's slate of electors, so the Republican slate of electors, are the certified electors. They're basically the handful of individuals who say, we represent the will of the people in Hawaii and we vote for Nixon. But when an alternate slate of electors was submitted, then there was an alternate slate of electors who said Kennedy won it and we're representing Kennedy. So this is not without legal precedent. Now, the difference between what was done back in the 1960s and what was done in 2020 by Trump's team is there wasn't some ongoing recount, so there was not any legal reason to believe that an alternate slate of electors would even be submitted. So detractors will argue that all that they were doing was introducing more submission and a pretext for Mike Pence to not certify the election result and demand that we go through a recount. But this wasn't some like massive case of fraud, because it's not like these electors were forging signatures or like they would deceive anyone, and like people couldn't just look at the news results and the election polling to clearly see that, yes, Biden did win in those states. Like, obviously he did, but this was just a legal device that was used to try to delay certification of the results and force a recount. And it didn't work. But it's not fake electors. It's an ultimate slate of electors that was not ultimately accepted. So that's how I look at the fake electors plot. And yeah, I mean, it's Trump's team using whatever they can to try to dispute an election that they genuinely believe was stolen from them. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. So now if we get to the January 6th protests, again, you have to look at the context here. At this point, the conservative voices had been censored. We now know that there was election interference. The government was colluding with social media platforms to censor different voices. And there's a lot of resentment and anger among the MAGA movement, understandably. And while it's unusual for a president himself to call for a protest, we should remember that a protest is the embodiment of the First Amendment. The protest is a time-honored tradition of using the First Amendment to protest what people perceive as totalitarianism. The entire Revolutionary War started with the Boston Tea Party, a protest. So although it's unusual for a president to call for a protest himself, I don't think it's inappropriate for him to do so. And this is probably the first time in history that a president ran against the government itself, basically. That was the MAGA movement. This was not about beating a party. This was about beating what they viewed as a corrupt establishment. So, of course, that doesn't abdicate any responsibility on Trump to do what he can to make a peaceful protest. But if we look at the chronology of events, on January 6th, the protest started with a rally called the Save America rally led by Trump himself, where he explicitly called for the protest to be peaceful. He called for the people who were gathered there to protest peacefully. And multiple times throughout the day, both on True Social, because he was banned off of Twitter, and on video and live at the rally, he called for the protest to be peaceful. Now, that said, he also called for the protesters to fight like hell. And I think it's a mark against Trump that he's very incendiary in his rhetoric. And frankly, that's part of why his strategy works and why he even got into office in the first place. And I think it's a fair criticism of him that he needs to tamp down the rhetoric, especially when he sees that people are getting agitated and there's a potential for violence. But he did call for people to be peaceful. And similarly, like he tweeted that the election fraud is grounds for terminating rules, even those found in the Constitution. And people said that he's calling for termination of the Constitution, which is not quite the same thing. But in particular cases like that, he needs to be more careful with his language. But ultimately, look, I think if you understand the worldview of the MAGA movement, it makes perfect sense that they protested. It's unfortunate that it got violent, but look, the Black Lives Matter protesters got violent too. And I don't think anyone was calling for violent protests, but that's what happens when you get mob mentality and people are really upset and incensed by what they view as a genuine injustice, and that's how the MAGA movement viewed it. So if you're considering voting for Trump and you're uncomfortable about any of the circumstances around the 2020 election, that's how I would reconcile your view. Hope you enjoy this. One last note here. So I've been asked by some people, do I think that the 2020 election was rigged? And the way I look at it is, look, first, I don't know. I don't know how I could know. But here's how I think about it. We have 300 million people in the country. Of course, there's some level of fraud in every single election, not just 2020. So the real question is there a non-trivial, non-zero amount of election fraud? And then I look at things circumstantially and I question, okay, well, is it even plausible that there was election fraud? Well, in 2020, we had these lockdowns. So we went from 33 million mail-in votes to 65 mail-in votes. The margin by which Trump lost the 2020 election was about, I don't know, anywhere between, let's say, 40,000 and 120,000 electoral college votes, depending on how you slice the different battleground states. In addition to that, we have now, but even back then, we had a lot of illegal immigrants in the country. On top of that, we have no universal voter ID requirement. So you can get into arguments and say, well, why would an illegal immigrant even want to put themselves at risk by voting in the election? And okay, well, how could someone even defraud the election? You know, why would someone even expose themselves to that risk? But I think it's fair to say that from a layperson point of view, from just a perceptual standpoint, there's a lot of attack vectors that don't actually feel secure, from the mail-in voting to the lack of voter ID to the fact that we have people here illegally in the country. And if we look at the incentives, I mean, yeah, the Democrats have a strong incentive to cheat, as do the Republicans. All politicians have a strong incentive to cheat. So we shouldn't be naive. We should make sure that the security holes are as filled as possible so that any attack vector is removed, not just from a technical standpoint, but removed in the perception of the American people. And I don't think that was the case in 2020. All that said, look, in a sports game, even if the referee makes bad calls, or even if we find out in hindsight that the referee was actually corrupt, we still have to honor the results that the system produces. And we can do that while challenging the system. And I think ultimately, if we look at it, as I said, Trump called for peaceful protests on January 6th. There was a peaceful transfer of power on January 20th. And I think it's perfectly fair for him to say, look, I think this system is rigged, and I accept the results. Now, my criticism of Trump is I wish he did that with more grace, and I wish he would just outright say, I am choosing to honor the democratic process by stepping down, and I dispute the results, and I want the system to be as bulletproof as possible so that we don't have a repeat of the situation in 2024. And he hasn't done that, and I wish he would, because I think that my fundamental criticism of Trump is his rhetoric. I think he just lacks grace, and he's not careful in his rhetoric a lot of the time. But I also think that we should be grateful, in fact, for Trump having this unyielding nature and forcing a stress test of a system. And I think both Republicans and Democrats should say, hey, yeah, you know what? There's actually some things in the system that should cause everyone to have questions about its veracity. So instead of just calling Trump some sore loser who wants to overthrow democracy, instead we should look at the system and we say, what can we do to make sure that the system is so safe and so secure that we don't have to go through this shit again? Because guess what? Trump was not the first person to challenge election results. He won't be the last. Hillary Clinton did the same thing. It's just that Trump did it a lot more loudly and frankly effectively. But rather than ignoring the stress test, let's look at the results of the stress test and make changes that make it so that we can all trust the system rather than having to rely on something as vague as faith in democracy.